Hello, this is Michelle Miller for Global Ecology, and today we are going to be talking about materials and energy. So we'll start today with a discussion of matter, and matter in biology really is anything that has mass. And when we look at matter, we see that there are some forms of matter that are referred to as elements. And elements are special because they have physical properties that are unique to them, and they cannot be broken down by any normal physical means, into anything smaller. So when we look at the elements, generally these are composed of all the same type of atom. So for example, we can talk about helium. So helium is an element. It's actually a gas, and it's relatively non-reactive. And it is composed of helium atoms. And this would be as opposed to, say, for example, carbon, which is composed of carbon atoms. And so you might be familiar with elements because elements have been put into a periodic table that looks something like this. And so these are all the elements as they have been identified and described. And so we can see that some of them are familiar to us and some of them are not so familiar. The familiar ones are the ones that we generally are composed of and other living things are composed of. So for example, like carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, sulfur, phosphorus. Okay. Silica is actually not something that is in our body, but it is what makes up glass and sand, for example. So some of these elements are important from a biological perspective. Other elements we actually mine. So in our industrial processes, we can use some of these other elements and they can be important. So we'll talk about two of these, which would include lead and cadmium, which is lead and cadmium right here. So in your chapter, in your book, they specifically deal with these two elements, which are not found in living things, but that we use every day, and that unfortunately are also toxic to us. And so sometimes they end up in the environment and cause problems. So I'm not going to really talk too much about the atomic structure. But an atom is composed of neutrons and protons in the nucleus, and then the electrons that orbit the nucleus. And so this is kind of the fundamental unit of matter, would be the atom. And one of the really interesting things too, from a kind of a physics perspective and kind of a philosophical perspective that's interesting about it, is that there's lots of empty space in matter. So even though we appear solid, and you know, material like your table or your desk or your computer appears solid, there's actually lots of empty space. But it's the forces that are between the nucleus and the electrons, and the forces between atoms that make it appear and make it to us physical. Okay, so when we look at the matter, we can talk about elements that are important as nutrients. So when we talk about nutrients, we can talk about macronutrients. Oops, this pen's not going to work there. So we can talk about macronutrients, for example. And these are the large amounts of nutrients that we need in our body. So we can abbreviate this in a form that is easy to remember, which, for example, is called SHNOPS. So this is carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and sulfur. So, for example, if you took a human and you completely dehydrated them, for example, 1/2 to 2/3 of the mass of me completely dehydrated would actually consist of carbon. And the reason for that is that carbon is the unit, it's kind of the fundamental basic structure of organic molecules. So when we look at organic molecules, we are a carbon-based organism. So we can look at organic molecules. And these have a carbon skeleton. And what that means is it's usually a long chain of carbon atoms. And then there are other elements that are covalently bonded to them. Okay, and this is as opposed to inorganic molecules. Okay, so these lack a carbon skeleton. Okay, so for example, we could talk about an organic molecule like propane. So propane is a fuel that is oftentimes burned to produce energy, like when you're using it in your barbecue. And it is 3 carbons attached like that, and then we have hydrogen attached and covalently bonded in these different areas. So if I looked at my propane, excuse me, it would be C3, and then I would add up all the hydrogen, so there'd be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So it'd be H8. So that is propane. So that is an example of an organic molecule. When we look at inorganic molecules, salt is sodium chloride, water, for example, oxygen. So these are all kind of familiar, hopefully familiar to you. So these would be inorganic, whereas this would be organic. And so the macronutrients includes carbon. Generally, we take in carbon in the form of like carbohydrates, but also carbon is found in proteins, carbon is found as lipids, and carbon is found in nucleic acids. And so we take in lots of carbon. We could also talk about micronutrients or trace nutrients. So trace nutrients. And these are things that we just need in a small amount. So for example, we need iron in our diet. And we need iron in order to build hemoglobin. Some organisms don't use iron in their blood to carry oxygen, but they either use copper. So for example, some invertebrates have, instead of red blood, they might have blue or green blood, and that is because they have copper instead of iron. And then we also use iodine. So this is iron, and this is iodine. And we use iodine to produce thyroxine. And so we have to have that in that element in our diet in order to produce a thyroid hormone called thyroxine, which regulates metabolism. And so these are elements that we need a little bit of. Okay. So here they talk about the difference between the trace elements and then the major constituents, the major things that make up the body. Okay, so one of the interesting things about matter is that the amount of matter can neither be created nor destroyed as it is changed from one form to another. So we call it the conservation of matter. So matter is not created or destroyed during transformations. So for example, we have all of the material, all of the matter on the planet today that we are going to have unless we get some from outer space, right? And so asteroids can bring new materials to the planet, and that may have been really important in the past to get new materials and relative amounts of material in the planet. So what this means is that as we use material, it is constantly recycled. So like when we use lead, for example, we don't use it up. It will always go somewhere. So we can say that matter is recycled, and it can end up in our products, but it also could end up in the air or the soil or the water. So there's a great discussion in your textbook about lead. And lead has the elemental symbol Pb, and that's because it was plumbrum is the Greek name for it. And that actually is the word for plumbing, because lead has been used in pipes, right? So for example, water pipes, we have lead in pipes. But we also have lead in batteries. So your car battery uses lead, right? And this is something that's not in our body, but it's something that we mine and that we harvest from the planet, and then that we transform so that we can build products. It was in leaded gas. Now, unfortunately, lead is a neurotoxin, and it is especially bad for children. So when you hear about there being found lead in water, like for example in schools, that's a really bad thing, because it can lead to developmental disabilities, right? Mental developmental disabilities in children. Okay, so if we look at what lead looks like in its elemental form, this is what it looks like. So it's mined from the planet, or from the ground. So we mine it, we purify it, and then we make our products out of it. And unfortunately, sometimes it ends up in the water. So you might have heard of the controversy surrounding the Flint, Michigan water supply. And that they have such high levels of lead, and unfortunately some of the governmental officials realized it but didn't notify the public. So there's a huge controversy. And the thing about Flint, Michigan is it's relatively poor people, and so you have this problem with environmental justice. So you have, like, if this would have happened in a more wealthier environment, or like subdivision, for example, would this have been a problem? So Flint, Michigan, there's lots of old houses and buildings in Flint, Michigan, and they have lead pipes. So the lead pipes became damaged by the corrosive water that was brought in from the river. So they changed their water supply, and they started getting it from the river, and it started to corrode. The water had chloride in it from salt that was put on the roads, for example. So there's lots of chloride ions in the water, and it started to corrode the lead pipes. And so then we get lead in the drinking water. Now, lead is one of those contaminants that is regulated by the Clean Water Act. So in the 1970s, people started to realize that we were contaminating our environment with certain things that were really bad, and that we needed to make sure that there was regulations that helped protect people from this contamination. So in the 1970s, we developed the Clean Water and the Clean Air Act. And so this is why, for example, when you go to the gas station, you have to be kind of old to realize this, but they used to ask you if you wanted unleaded or if you wanted regular. And so regular actually had lead in it. And so as the gasoline was being burned in your engine, lead was being released into the atmosphere, And then it could get into the soils, and it could also get into the water, and you could breathe it in. And so it would cause problems in the respiratory tract as well. Okay. So lead is a problem. And so if you look at the drinking water, and now I think they still are having to buy bottled water in order to drink it, in order to have drinking water. So there's the difference between Flint water and Detroit water. Okay. So another element that has been used that is not part of our, oh, I forgot to mention this. So I wanted to mention this. So we also have another source of lead contamination, which is lead ammunition. And it's actually sometimes also in your fishing lures and sinkers. So we can look at lead ammunition. Okay. So what happens with the lead ammunition is that hunters will hunt with lead ammunition, and then it gets into the food. And so it gets into the carcasses of the birds. So perhaps if you are a hunter and you're hunting ducks, for example, and you're using a lead in your shotgun, then what's going to happen is that the ducks that get the lead die, but they don't get retrieved. And so then you have predators eating the contaminated food. And so one of the big problems is lead poisoning in eagles and other birds of prey and other scavengers. I'm sure it's a problem not just in eagles, but it's because eagles are, you know, our country bird. It's significant. And so there's a video on in your textbook that shows how this affects the birds, and it is essentially just kind of shuts down their nervous system so that they can't walk, they have a hard time breathing, and then they eventually die. And so this has been controversial because whether or not we should regulate and do away with lead ammunition, since there are alternatives to this type of ammunition. And the hunters argue that they should be free to use whatever ammunition they want, and also that lead ammunition is cheaper than the other ammunition, so it is an unfair burden to them economically to have to switch to a different type of ammunition. Okay, so another example of this is cadmium. So this is one of the reasons why you should recycle your batteries, especially if they are like nickel cadmium batteries, right? Because these are put into batteries, so 70% have batteries. And cadmium is also a toxic substance that can cause problems with the lungs and also with the liver. And if we look at other things that it is found in, it is also found in pigments. And so for those of you who are artists, you might enjoy these really bright pigments. I can't do that. You might enjoy these really bright pigments like cadmium orange or cadmium red. And so they use that. And so you have to be really careful when you use these pigments that have cadmium in them, and do not breathe them in. And you have to, you know, like dispose of them properly, because this is a substance that is toxic. So the point here is that elements and materials do not break down, right? And so that if you use them, they don't ever get used up. They just go someplace else, right? So they just are continually recycled in the ecosystem. Okay, so that is material. And so next we're going to look at energy, and we're going to define energy as the ability to do work. Now, sometimes energy is stored, and we call that potential energy. So this is stored energy. So a good example of this would be fat, right? So we store energy as fat. Humans do, and other mammals do, also as a form of insulation. And then we have kinetic energy, and this is doing work. So this is energy doing work. So me writing on this board is an example of kinetic energy because I am moving my hand, right? So this would be like movement. Another good example of this would be in rivers that have been dammed. So if you have a huge reservoir that is a source of potential energy, and then as you let the water move through the dam, it will turn turbines, and so then it turns in from potential, the water movement turns from potential energy in the reservoir to kinetic energy as it moves through the dam, right? And then we can generate electricity from that. So there are different types of energy besides just potential and kinetic. So we can talk about the types. And one type that's really important to ecosystems is what is called electromagnetic energy. And this travels in waves. And so if we look at an example of this, this would be like visible light. Okay. We also have ultraviolet radiation. And we experience this when we're sitting in the sun and we heat up in the sun, because it's not the visible light that is actually heating us up, it's actually the ultraviolet radiation. And that is also actually what burns us. And then we have things like X-rays, which are also electromagnetic energy. We have radio waves. We have microwaves, which heat up food, cause the molecules in the food to start to move faster. So we have microwaves. And so in your book, they talk about how it has to do with the frequency of these waves, whether or not, for example, we can see it. So there's only a small portion of the electromagnetic energy that we can see as visible light. So this is the spectrum. So we have radio waves, microwaves, I didn't mention infrared, but visible, this is the point where we can actually see. And notice that this is like the prism, right? So this is the rainbow prism. If you break white light into its components, that's what you'll see. And then we have ultraviolet, X-ray, and we have gamma ray, for example. And so that's electromagnetic energy. And obviously, solar energy is part of this. So this is solar energy, and solar energy can be captured by plants. And that is the basis for most of the energy in our ecosystems, all except for the ecosystems that are in the deep ocean and can rely upon chemicals that are released from the center of the planet. Okay, so that's electromagnetic. We also have chemical energy. And so chemical energy is where we store energy in bonds between atoms. So this is energy stored between the bonds, or stored, maybe, sorry, in the bonds between atoms. Okay, so that's chemical energy. So glucose, C6H12O6, 6 carbon, 12 hydrogen, 6 oxygen. This is glucose. This is what our brain runs on. And a lot of our muscles too rely upon the presence of glucose. We also have mechanical energy. Right? So this has to do with movement. So this tends to be physical. So like the skeletal muscles contracting would be an example of mechanical energy. The moving of a turbine, of the windmill, would be an example of mechanical energy. We have electrical energy. And this is specifically, so I'll put physical movement here. Physical movement. This is specifically movement of charged particles. Okay, so the electrical current that runs through your house is the movement of electrons. The electrons are very small particles which have a negative charge, right? So this is an example of electrical energy. We also have electrical energy in our body, but it's not the movement of electrons, it's the movement of other ions like sodium and potassium that move, that create the electrical energy in our body. So this is just an example, movement of the electrons in a wire, for example. And then we also have nuclear energy, and we're not going to spend a lot of time on nuclear energy in this class. But nuclear energy is the bonds that, the energy in the bonds that hold the atoms together. So the energy that holds atoms together. So if you can break an atom apart, then you can release a tremendous amount of energy. And some atoms are unstable, and they are said to be radioactive, and they kind of fall apart on their own, and they can release energy that way too. Okay, so that's nuclear energy. And then we can talk about temperature. So this is heat. And heat energy, we're going to talk quite a bit about this because a lot of our energy is lost as heat. This is low quality in terms of how we can capture it. So it's hard to capture. And what it is, what it represents is the movement of the molecules. So for example, we can take water, liquid water, and we can add heat to it, and the water molecules will move faster and faster and faster until they eventually turn into steam. And when we lose heat to the environment, however, it's really hard for us to capture it. So like when I'm hot and sweaty, that energy that's being put off of me is not easily or readily captured back by any other types of organisms, including me. Okay, so those are the kinds of energy. And if we look at the energy that we use in our society, we can talk about the renewable versus the non-renewable. So non-renewable means that within our lifetime, or even within many, many generations, it would be impossible to replace it. So you notice here the petroleum and coal and natural gas, uranium, those are all non-renewable because there's no way for us to quickly replace them. Biomass refers to trees, and so trees are stored energy, and they are renewable in the sense that we can cut them down and we can replant them. Hydropower, right? We can wait for the reservoir to fill back up again because of the hydrological cycle. That would be renewable. Propane is non-renewable. Geothermal is renewable, wind and solar. And so these are just the types of energy that we use to power our industries and our lifestyles. Okay, so we want to talk about the laws of thermodynamics. And the first law is, and I just think that there's certain parts of this board that aren't responding. So the first law is that there is no increase or decrease in the amount of energy when we convert it. So the amount of energy stays the same, okay? So that just like the conservation of matter. So the amount of energy stays the same during a conversion. And I'll put semicolon, there is no loss or gain. Okay. The second law, which is really also really important to biological systems, is that when you convert from one form of energy into the other, it is inefficient. And so energy is lost as heat. So the conversion of energy to one form from another. Okay, the conversion is inefficient of energy. We'll put energy is inefficient. Okay, so energy is lost, specifically as heat. So it doesn't disappear, but it just goes to a low quality form of it. Okay, so as I mentioned before, we have stored in our muscles chemical energy. Right? And this can be converted to mechanical energy. It can be converted to movement. That conversion is not 100%. So we lose energy as heat. And some conversions are more efficient than others. And so if we're designing a system in which we're trying to conserve the energy and get the most out of it, we want to figure out which conversions lose heat the most and which conversions retain energy. Okay. So actually, I wanted to show this next slide. Okay, so this is an example of conversion of energy. And this is an electrical power plant that is taking carbon, that is taking carbon and converting it to electricity. So let's see if I can scroll down a little bit here. There we go. Okay. So coal is burned, right? So it is combusted, and it's done so in a boiler. And so you can kind of sometimes see these in our environment. I actually believe there's one nearby on the way to Boardman, where you take the coal and you're going to burn it, and you're going to unfortunately release lots of heat. But in the process, you're going to heat up water, and that is going to turn the water to steam. And then the steam is going to turn the turbines, which is then eventually going to convert that energy, that mechanical energy, into electrical energy. So we would say that coal is chemical energy. Right? We actually convert this into thermal energy. Right? So we're actually heating up the water and turning it into steam. And this is a diagram from your book that you should look at. Okay. And then we turn it into mechanical energy. Right. And so this is the turning of the turbine. And then we turn it into electrical energy. And this is the generator, electrical generator, okay? So at each of these processes, at each of these steps, we lose, okay? And so when we convert coal to steam, we lose about 13%. And so we'll say that it, actually I won't put an arrow there. We'll say that it's 87% efficient. So we have 87% efficient. So 13% has been lost. And then when we go from steam to mechanical energy, this is only 46% efficient. So we've actually lost 54% of the energy. And then this is very efficient. So this is 98% efficient. Okay. So notice that we lose energy at each level. And so this is a good example of the different types of energy, but it's also a good example of the second law of thermodynamics. Okay. And so it can tell you what is wasted as heat, right? The amount of calories that has been wasted as heat as these conversions take place. Okay, so another thing about energy is that things, energy and matter, actually this is kind of a putting them together, things will tend to go to a state of disorder. So when we look at the word entropy, entropy is actually used in physics, and it is a measure of disorder. Okay, so if we have a lot of disorder, like here, we would say that this is high entropy. Okay, so this is an increase in disorder. Okay, so the bike is starting to break down. This one is low entropy. And so this would be that you have low disorder. So you have a decrease in disorder. A little confusing. Okay. So things, substances will tend to go towards a state of disorder automatically. So substances spontaneously move towards higher entropy. Okay, so what we have to do in order to maintain order, and everybody has experienced this because this is like my house right now. So if you spend time picking up every day, it stays pretty clean, right? But if you like go a couple days without picking up, all of a sudden things start to go to disorder. And that is just a natural law that we cannot, it takes energy to keep a clean house, right? And so this is really important to realize that this is the natural order of things, right? And that if we're a living organism, in order to maintain our order, it takes energy. And so I have to take in energy just for maintenance, just to maintain my order. As soon as I die, my cells will start to break down and my whole body will go to a state of entropy or disorder, and I will start to decompose, okay? So that's the idea of entropy, and it's really important from a energy in ecosystems to energy in animals and plants. Okay, so we're going to move next to energy in biological systems. And so when we look at what we need energy for, what biological organisms need energy for, we need energy for maintenance. So I just mentioned that as this relates to need, maybe it's the way I'm holding my pen. Starting to get used to this. Okay, it's not looking there. Need for maintenance. Okay, so just to maintain my order, I need energy. So this is not a very profitable form of using energy. Just to maintain me, I would rather grow and maybe also reproduce, okay? So if I'm thinking of like a plant, I don't want my plant just to maintain, if I'm growing a garden, I don't want the plant to just maintain its same size. I actually want it to have enough energy that it's actually going to grow, and maybe it's actually going to bear fruit. So I want my tomato plants to get big, and I want them to have lots of flowers and lots of fruit on them. So it's used also for growth, reproduction, storage, and protection. Okay. So there are strategies for getting energy and using energy. One strategy is to be an autotroph. So this literally means self-feeding. So auto means feeding, troph means feeding. So these are organisms that are capable of photosynthesis. So like plants and things like algae in the ocean, phytoplankton, for example, are capable of photosynthesis. Okay, so if we look at this, where they get their energy is from solar energy. So we have in our atmosphere carbon dioxide. And when I write 6 CO2, what that means is that these are 6 carbon dioxide molecules. So this is carbon dioxide. This is what we breathe out, and it is in our atmosphere. We can combine this with 6 water molecules, H2O, plus sunlight, solar energy. And then we can get out of this stored chemical energy. Oops, plus, sorry. Oh, I need a 6 in there, plus 6. Okay. So this is the chemical equation for photosynthesis. And so if you think about this, plants take in carbon dioxide, they remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and they need water, and they need sunlight. And this is glucose. So this is stored energy. Now, what do they use that glucose for? There's another chemical reaction that goes exactly the opposite of this one. So this is what is referred to as cellular respiration. So plants also do cellular respiration, but also animals. And so this is where you just write this chemical equation backwards. But instead of solar energy, we get chemical energy in the form of a molecule called ATP. And so this is energy for the body to do work, right? So we use ATP to maintain our constant internal environment in our cells. We also use ATP for muscle contraction. Now, the opposite, or kind of the other strategy from being an autotroph, right? So that's one strategy, would be to be a heterotroph. So hetero literally means other, feeding. And this is where we eat plants and animals. Other organisms, we could also eat bacteria and fungi, right? Plants and animals, we'll just put other organisms to obtain energy. So we are heterotrophs. Almost all animals are. There are a few animals that do have photosynthetic algae in them, like coral, which we'll talk about later. But coral have algae in their cells, but they're also eating stuff from the ocean. Okay, so those are the two strategies. Now, when we look at heterotrophs, we can talk about, we have to go out and forage, and we also have to capture our prey. And so what we need to talk about is the energy return on investment. Okay, so the energy return refers to the amount of energy in the prey. Oops, amount of energy in the prey. Okay. Investment is the amount of energy it takes to obtain the prey. Okay, so this is important only for heterotrophs. And so this has to be greater than that, right? So if I'm going to go out and hunt, I have to bring home food that is more than it took me to hunt. So if I expend more energy while hunting, and I kind of actually always argued, I had a boyfriend who would go hunting, and he would go and he would get a hotel room, and he would go out to dinner, and he would drive his truck, and then he would might come home with something, right? And I would say the investment that you just made in going out hunting really didn't pay for itself, right? Because you might have come home with nothing, right? And so our hunting strategies these days are more in terms of recreation in a lot of places, like in the Western world, right, where we're developed, than in actually looking for food. So you have to be really efficient. If you imagine if that is how you're obtaining your food, you're not gonna spend a lot of energy to get it. Okay. So let's look at two different types of lizards, or different types of lizards. And so we can look at this in lizards. So an example of this is in lizards. Okay, so small lizards can go out and hunt insects, and they can get enough energy so that they have a return on their investment, so that the amount of energy they get is greater than the investment of hunting lizards. And so small lizards tend to be carnivorous. But when we look at the large lizards, if you think about what they might have to eat, they might eat small birds and mammals. And there's no way that a large lizard is going to be able to move fast enough to get large prey like birds and mammals. And so large lizards, just because of this trade-off, tend to be herbivores. Okay, so here's the collared lizard in size, and you can see that there's a graph here. So if your body mass gets too great and your metabolic rate is too high, you have to be a herbivore, because eating plant material is less energetically expensive than it is eating animals. Now, the exception to this is kind of interesting, and it is the Komodo dragon. So in your book, they talk about this. Oops. So the Komodo dragon has a different strategy. And so instead of going out and hunting, it's an ambush predator. Right, so it just sits and waits for its prey. And the other thing about it that's really interesting is it doesn't actually kill directly its animals, but it has so much bacteria on it in its claws and its mouth that scratches and bites become infected. So scratches and bites on prey become infected. Then the prey dies. And the Komodo dragon's really good at smell, so the Komodo dragon scavenges the carcass. Okay, so that's strategies and energy. Okay, thermoregulation is a type of maintenance. It's actually a form of maintenance, and it is also a strategy. So when we look at endotherms, endotherms use their metabolism to regulate their body temperature. So for example, birds and mammals are endotherms. We are endotherms. So when we get cold, our metabolic rate will go up, and we'll even shiver a little bit to produce heat, and the body temperature will increase. Okay. The opposite of this, the opposite strategy would be being an ectotherm. An ectotherm, which means that they use the environment to regulate their body temperature. Okay, so for example, fish, bony fish, and amphibians and reptiles right? And invertebrates, like insects, okay, would be ectotherms. Now, it's important to realize that cold-blooded and warm-blooded are not appropriate terms to use here, because if I am a lizard and I'm sitting on a hot rock, my body temperature is going to be really high, but I'm regulating it by sunbathing, right? And that's how I'm increasing my body temperature. So there's cost-benefit analysis that we can look at for these strategies. And so the cost-benefit analysis, is that being an endotherm takes energy, but it means that we can be active in all kinds of environments, right? So this means, like, if I was cost benefit of endothermy. Okay, so we have an increase metabolic rate, right? But we also have the ability to be active under cold temperatures. And in some cases, we could hibernate, right? So hibernation, like bears hibernating, right? This is used to conserve energy. Okay. So if I'm an ectotherm, like I'm a snake, I don't actually have to eat as much as an endotherm. So we have to increase food consumption. So that's why, like, if you have a snake, maybe you only feed it a rat every month, right? And that's all it needs because it has such a low metabolic rate. So if we look at the comparison in your book, there's a comparison about the amount of energy. Okay, so if you have 100 kcals of food, notice that only 12% of it goes to maintenance. But I'm an endotherm, so 50% of it goes to maintenance for me. So I might be able to, if I'm a snake, I might be able to put more energy into growth, more energy into reproduction than if I'm an endotherm. So there are costs and benefits to each strategy, okay? But endotherms can use a wider variety of environments compared to ectotherms, so they can live in colder climates, for example. Okay, so we can talk about development and growth. So this would be an example of growth and development. So one of the interesting things about animals is sometimes they undergo metamorphosis, and this means that they change in body form as they age, right? And so a good example of this would be the butterflies. So you have, you have a larval stage, which is the caterpillar. So this is my larvae. And then the caterpillar goes into a dormant stage, which is the pupa, and then it emerges as a butterfly, and that is the adult. So this is an interesting question as to what is the benefit of having caterpillars and butterflies having a different body form at earlier stages. And so one hypothesis kind of describes the resource partitioning. So we have an example of resource partitioning. Right? So the caterpillar is herbivorous, right? So it feeds upon the leaves of the plants. And then the butterfly is nectivorous. So it feeds upon the nectar that is produced by flowers, right? And so these do not compete for access to the same resources. So they partition the resources. And maybe, you know, early on, the plants are growing in your garden and then they flower. And then at that same time, the caterpillars might metamorphosis and become butterflies, okay? So that's one idea. The other example would be the life cycles that we see in a lot of animals, specifically aquatic invertebrates. Okay, so in aquatic invertebrates, oftentimes we see mobile larvae, and then these settle down and become sessile adults. Okay. So a good example of this in your book that they show are the barnacles. And this is something that we see over and over and over again, that sexual production, the production of offspring, the larvae tend to swim. They tend to be mobile. They tend to disperse into new environments. And once they disperse into an environment which is good for them, then they settle down and they become sessile adults. And so in your book, there's a diagram. This is the larvae of a barnacle, okay? And so barnacles are actually arthropods. They're actually related to shrimp, for example, and the larvae are mobile and the adults are sessile. And so that would be another example of metamorphosis. And that is an example of development. Okay, so we also need to store energy. And so this would be like growth, right? And when we look at plants, plants tend to store energy as carbohydrates. So for example, if you think about potatoes, if you've ever grown potatoes, you know that the roots, these are the roots, and the roots are composed of cells that contain starch, right? And the potatoes can overwinter, and then in the spring, they sprout. And then they form leaves and flowers, and then they can reproduce that way. But the roots are starch, okay? We can also look at sugar maples. Sugar maples, which are trees. And these maples store their energy as sugar in the roots. And then it moves as sap to the branches in the spring. And so people will go out and they'll tap the sugar maples and drain some of the sap out, which is what the sugar maple stored overwintering, so that it can produce leaves in the spring. Okay, so that's plants. We as animals store energy as fats. Okay, and specifically endotherms store energy as fats because they can use fat as insulation. So it can be underneath the skin. We also have fat inside our body cavities, like there's fat around our kidneys, there's fat around our hearts, and some people get fat in their belly, and that's called visceral fat, and it causes the big beer belly. But we can also store it right underneath the skin, okay? And fat is a really good way of storing energy because it doesn't take a lot of water. Fat repels water, and so it can be stored in a very concentrated form in the body. And then when we convert it to energy, to ATP, it can release a lot of energy, okay? So that is the example of storage of energy. Okay, we also have reproduction. And again, just like with maintenance and thermoregulation, we have strategies. And not one strategy is better than the other, it's just different, okay? So one strategy is what is referred to as R-selected. And R refers to the maximum rate of growth. And we're going to talk about this when we start talking about population growth. And so R-selected species produce lots of small offspring. Right? So think about maybe insects, for example. So if you think about mosquitoes, they lay lots of eggs, and then the eggs become larvae, and then they metamorphose, and they go from being aquatic to being terrestrial and airborne. This is as opposed to K-selected species. So this is another strategy, and this is where we produce few large offspring. And we put a lot of energy into our offspring. So this would be lots of parental care, whereas there's no parental care generally with R-selected. So we put a lot of energy. Okay, so an example of this from your book would be, oops, I just want to skip over that, would be salmon. So this is an example of a salmon that was found scavenged, maybe by bears. And when they opened it up, it was full of eggs. And so that's an individual that's going to produce a lot of offspring, and only a few offspring survive. And then this is a mammal. So this is a whale, has subcutaneous fat. It is endothermic, and it is nursing its offspring. And so this is a baby attached to the nipple and getting milk. And so this would be K-selected. Okay, so the last thing that we'll talk about is in terms of strategies and what we use energy for, and that is protection. And so when we look at plants sometimes look like they have protection, like they might have thorns, but most plants rely upon chemical protection. So they actually produce chemicals called alkaloids. And these are really biologically active chemicals. And so these can also, however, be toxins. So for example, the tobacco plant produces nicotine. And we know this because nicotine affects our body dramatically, increased heart rate, increased blood pressure, right? And nicotine is actually an insecticide. So the reason why the tobacco plant uses it is that it actually kills caterpillars that are feeding upon it. And most of the tobacco plants that were grown early in the century were actually used to get nicotine for an insecticide, but we also smoke it now. So it's really biologically active. Okay. And so it's kind of interesting, lots of our spices that we use in our food is spices that are antimicrobial. So spices tend to be antimicrobial, which means that they inhibit the growth of bacteria. And so if we look in places where food has to be preserved, we can see that spices are used abundantly. And then in colder climates where food doesn't have to be preserved, we don't use spices as abundantly. So if we look at India and we look at all of the spices that they use, right? This is because India is a warm country and the food would spoil, and so that actually helps to preserve it, compared to Norway, where there's fewer spices used. They use onion, ginger, pepper, bay leaf, lemon, lime, parsley, and maybe a little bit of this, the dillweed, capers, and caraway. And then if you look at the percentage of bacteria species inhibited, you can see that like garlic is super antimicrobial. So is onion, allspice, oregano. And then if you look down there, some of these more like celery seeds, not so much, lemon, lime, a little bit, okay? So the spices that we get from our foods and the way that we use them are a product of the evolution of plants developing defenses against microbes and predators. Now, if we look at in animals, obviously we have lots of protection. So for example, we can have horns, we can have claws, right, etc. for protection. But there is also some chemicals that are produced by animals as well. So for example, these are the poison arrow dart frogs, right? And so we can say poison, okay? This is the poison arrow dart frog, which you can see, but you wouldn't want to touch it. So one of the interesting things about animals is that they're not camouflaged at all, but this is actually a warning sign. So if you're ever in the tropics and you see this like bright patterned frog, do not touch it, right? Because it's probably which is in decline and we're trying to save it, right? The monarch butterfly feeds on milkweed. And milkweed has a toxin in it, and so it makes the butterfly also toxic. And so the butterfly, if you eat that butterfly and you're a bird or a reptile, for example, perhaps you will get sick from it. Okay, so there's also poisons in animals as well as plants. Okay, last topic. So how does this energy flow in an ecosystem? So we have what are called food chains, where we look at the movement of energy from one group of organisms to another. We also have food webs, which look at the interaction between species and on a different group. And then we also have ecological pyramids, which track the energy. So these are all ideas. So if we look at a food chain, here is a terrestrial food chain. So in this desert, notice that the food chain is shorter than this aquatic food chain, which has more layers to it. There's less in this particular instance, there's less energy. If we're talking about desert vegetation, there's less energy to begin with. And so as we move up through these groups of organisms, we are going to lose energy, okay? So in the food chain, we have what are called the primary producers. Primary, that's a P, primary producers. And these are the autotrophs. Then we have the primary consumers. And these are the herbivores. So these are herbivores. And then we have the secondary consumers, which are carnivores. Okay. So this would be an example. These two would be examples of food chains. And then if we look at food webs, we can see that there's lots of interactions between different species. So not only do we have grasshoppers feeding upon the desert plants, but we have ants. And we also have, as a primary consumer, the kangaroo rat and a chipmunk, it looks like, right? And then we have many, many more organisms within this ecosystem as we move up. Okay, so the idea of ecological pyramids is really important. So we can talk about primary productivity, and we're talking about net primary productivity. Shoot, primary productivity. Okay. So primary productivity is the energy that is captured by plants. They capture energy from the sun by plants. And then it is what they can put into growth and reproduction. Okay. So this is the energy captured by plants. And put into biomass. So biomass is like the mass of the plant. Okay. So if we look at an ecological pyramid, at the base, we have the primary producers. And this block represents the amount of biomass, the amount of energy that is in this group of organisms. And then when we move up and we have the second block, right? And then we might have a third block. And notice how the amount of biomass gets smaller every time because energy gets lost as heat, right? So we lose energy at each level. And then we also, the biomass gets converted down here. So I'll put like 3 arrows down here. And this is the decomposers. So when plants die and they're not eaten, then bacteria and fungus takes over and decomposes it, and it provides nutrients for more plants to grow. Okay. So when we look at the shape of this ecological pyramid, it can be different depending upon what organisms are involved and where the ecosystem is. So notice this one, and notice how the differences between ectotherms and endotherms. So ectotherms do not use energy, as much energy for maintenance, because they do not use energy to maintain their body temperature. And so more of the energy gets put into the biomass. So notice how this is narrower than this one. So this is actually wider than this one. And notice how then the amount of energy that gets passed to the owl versus the lizard is smaller here. So this organism is using energy to regulate its temperature, and so is this one. Here we have more energy, so we can actually have more layers, more trophic levels to our ecological pyramid. So you want to come up with an ecological pyramid that you could reproduce. For example, one of your study questions is this idea of ecological pyramids, and to give an example of an ecological pyramid. And so you would want to, this is actually the vegetation, that's actually the base. And so one of the really interesting things about ecological pyramids is that if you think about all the snakes and you put their biomass together, that the biomass of the snake has to be less than the biomass of the insects down here. So there has to be more insects, and the biomass has to be bigger than, as you move up, than the top predators. And this applies to humans as well. So it's important to realize that we are part of an ecological pyramid as well, right? And so Vegetarians, right? Crops generally can feed more people than can livestock. Now, the exception here is if we're looking at land that is too arid to grow crops, but could possibly grow enough grass to feed cows. And so then it is a little bit different, and your textbook talks more about that. But vegetarians, right? We could have more people on the planet if everybody became vegetarian. And we could feed more people, and perhaps we wouldn't have so many famines and people dying of starvation and malnourishment. Okay, so that is my lecture for global ecology on matter and energy. And let me know if you have any additional questions. Oh, I forgot. Oh, we'll talk about this later. No, actually, I'll talk about it now. Sorry. I hope you did not turn off your thing. I forgot. It's like I had 2 more slides left. Okay, so the last thing about ecological pyramids is that we can have magnification of toxins. And so these are fat-soluble toxins that animals and plants accumulate in their body tissues. Accumulate in their body tissues. Okay. An example of this is DDT. And DDT was an insecticide that was used extensively during the 50s and the 60s. And it was an ecologist named Rachel Carson who wrote The Silent Spring that talked about the dangers of DDT. So DDT is a toxin that's fat soluble, and it is also an estrogen mimic. So what happens is it gets in the environment and it starts to accumulate. And so what we see is that as we move up the ecological pyramid, it becomes more concentrated. Okay, so let's look at the DDT in ecological pyramid here. And this is also going to be important when we get to nutrient pollution, the SymBio lab. Okay, so this is the amount of DDT. So notice how it's relatively not concentrated in the producers, but the consumers eat a lot of producers, right? And so it becomes more concentrated. And because it's fat soluble, you can't urinate it out. So it gets stored in the body. And then notice how it goes up and up and up until until it became a problem in, for example, eagles, because it was leading to the eggshell being so brittle that the eggs weren't able to hatch. And so there was this huge, we need to regulate, we need to decrease our, use of this insecticide. And what that did eventually is it led to some environmental regulations, and it led to a decrease in the use of a chemical like DDT. And then we see this amazing rebound of the population of raptors, including bald eagles. And so it's kind of a success story, although we still have other toxins in our environment. So DDT is not the only one. You might have heard of BPA, which was in plastic water bottles and in plastic toys that we were giving our children. And so bisphenol A, or BPA, is also an estrogen mimic and can lead to reproductive cancers. And so that has also been reduced. And now almost everybody knows that you should have BPA-free water bottles and that you should never microwave your plastics. So if you're heating up your food, you never microwave them in plastic or styrofoam, because you can get toxins leaching into your food. Okay, so there, now I'm truly finished. 39 out of 39.